March 1st, 1896, northern Ethiopia near the town of Adwa. General Oreste Baratieri commanded an Italian army of 17,000 men, equipped with modern rifles, artillery, and the confidence that came from being a European power facing an African kingdom. His mission was simple: conquer Ethiopia and add it to Italy's colonial empire. By sunset that day, his army would be destroyed. 7,000 Italians dead, thousands more wounded or captured. The survivors fleeing in panic. It was the worst defeat a European colonial power had ever suffered in Africa. But here's the truly remarkable part. Italy would return 40 years later with tanks, aircraft, and poison gas, and they would lose again. This is the story of Italy's double humiliation in Ethiopia. The military blunder so catastrophic they had to repeat it just to prove they could fail twice. This is war blunders. To understand this disaster, we need to understand the world of the 1890s. Europe was in the middle of the scramble for Africa. Major powers were carving up the continent into colonies. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, all were claiming vast territories. Italy, newly unified as a nation in 1861, wanted its share. They wanted to prove they were a great power too. They looked at Ethiopia. At the time, Ethiopia was one of only two independent African nations, the other being Liberia. It was ruled by Emperor Menelik II, a brilliant leader who understood European politics and knew how to play rival powers against each other. But the Italians saw what they wanted to see: a primitive African kingdom with obsolete weapons. Easy prey. Italy already controlled parts of what is now Eritrea and Somalia. They signed a treaty with Menelik, the Treaty of WWII, in 1889. Here's where it gets interesting. The treaty existed in two versions, Italian and Amharic. The Italian version stated that Ethiopia would become an Italian protectorate, essentially a colony. The Amharic version said Ethiopia could use Italian diplomatic channels if they wanted, but remained fully independent. When Menelik discovered the deception, he was furious. He repudiated the treaty in 1893. Italy's response was to invade. General Baratieri assembled his army: modern rifles, artillery pieces, well-drilled soldiers. He expected quick victory. What he didn't expect was that Emperor Menelik had been preparing for this moment for years. Menelik had modernized Ethiopia's military. He'd purchased thousands of rifles, ironically many from Italy itself. He'd stockpiled ammunition. He'd studied European military tactics. And he'd unified Ethiopia's various kingdoms and ethnic groups into a national army. By the time Baratieri invaded, Menelik commanded approximately 100,000 warriors. Many had modern rifles. They knew the terrain, and they were fighting for their homeland. February 1896, Baratieri's army pushed into Ethiopian territory. Supply lines stretched thin. The terrain was brutal, mountainous, dry, difficult. Baratieri knew he was in trouble. He wanted to withdraw and wait for reinforcements. But the Italian government, desperate for a victory, ordered him to attack. He obeyed. March 1st, 1896, dawn, the Battle of Adwa. Baratieri divided his forces into multiple columns to attack from different directions. It was a European tactic designed to confuse and overwhelm the enemy. It failed completely. The columns lost contact with each other in the mountain passes. Ethiopian scouts tracked their every move. Menelik positioned his forces perfectly. When the Italians emerged from the mountains, they walked into a trap. 100,000 Ethiopian warriors surrounded them from three sides. The Italians were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and fighting uphill in unfamiliar terrain. The battle lasted most of the day. It was brutal. Ethiopian cavalry charges smashed into Italian formations. Rifle fire tore through both sides. Hand-to-hand combat in the mountain passes. By afternoon, the Italian army was disintegrating. Soldiers threw away their rifles and ran. Officers lost control of their units. Some battalions were completely wiped out. Others surrendered en masse. By sunset, the disaster was complete. 7,000 Italian soldiers dead, 1,500 wounded, 3,000 captured, many of whom would be held for years until Italy paid ransom. Ethiopian casualties were significant too, around 4,000 to 7,000 killed, but they had won decisively. Baratieri fled with the survivors. Italy's colonial army was shattered. The international reaction was shock. A European army with modern weapons had been destroyed by an African force. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Ethiopia remained independent. Menelik became a hero across Africa and a symbol of resistance against colonialism. Italy was humiliated on the world stage. The defeat triggered a political crisis in Rome. The government fell. Italy's colonial ambitions were crushed. For nearly 40 years, Adwa stood as proof that European superiority was a myth, that African nations could defend themselves, that colonialism could be defeated. But Italy never forgot, never forgave, and never stopped planning revenge. October 3rd, 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia again. This time, they came with everything: tanks, aircraft, artillery, 400,000 troops, modern logistics, and a leader obsessed with washing away the humiliation of 1896. Benito Mussolini had risen to power in 1922, promising to restore Italian greatness and build a new Roman Empire. Ethiopia was personal. He called Adwa a stain on Italian honor. This time, there would be no mistakes. Or so he thought. The invasion began with overwhelming force. Italian bombers struck Ethiopian towns. Tanks rolled across the border. Artillery pounded defensive positions. Ethiopia's new emperor, Haile Selassie, commanded a force of around 500,000 warriors, but most still carried obsolete rifles. Some fought with spears. They had no air force, no tanks, no modern artillery. On paper, this should have been a massacre favoring Italy. It was. Just not the way Mussolini intended. Despite overwhelming technological superiority, the Italian advance was agonizingly slow. Ethiopian guerrilla tactics frustrated Italian commanders. Supply lines stretched across brutal terrain. Coordination between Italian units was terrible. And then Italy started using poison gas, mustard gas, dropped from aircraft, sprayed across battlefields, used against soldiers and civilians alike. It was a war crime, banned by international treaty. But Mussolini didn't care. The gas attacks were devastating. Ethiopian soldiers and civilians suffered horrific injuries. Entire villages were contaminated. The international community condemned Italy, but did nothing to stop them. Even with poison gas, the conquest took 7 months. 7 months to defeat a nation with almost no modern weapons. In May 1936, Italian forces entered Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's capital. Haile Selassie fled into exile. Mussolini declared victory and proclaimed the Italian Empire. The cost? Estimates vary, but Italy likely suffered 10,000 to 15,000 casualties conquering Ethiopia. Ethiopian casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, many from poison gas and reprisal massacres. Italy had won, but at enormous cost in money, men, and international reputation. And the occupation that followed was a disaster. Italian control was limited to major roads and towns. Ethiopian resistance fighters, Arbegnak, controlled the countryside. Ambushes, raids, assassinations. The insurgency never stopped. Italy poured resources into holding Ethiopia, resources they would desperately need just a few years later, because World War II was coming. January 1941. British and Commonwealth forces alongside Ethiopian resistance fighters and Haile Selassie himself, launched an invasion to liberate Ethiopia. Italy was now fighting World War II on multiple fronts. They were overstretched, undersupplied, and facing far better equipped enemies than Ethiopian warriors with spears. The campaign was shockingly quick. British forces, numbering only about 70,000, pushed into Ethiopia from Sudan and Kenya. Ethiopian resistance fighters rose up across the country. Haile Selassie returned to lead his people. The Italian garrison in Ethiopia numbered around $250,000, more than 3 times the British force. It didn't matter. Italian morale was terrible. Supply lines had collapsed. Many Italian commanders knew the war was lost and weren't willing to die for Mussolini's vanity. In just 5 months, the Italians were defeated. May 5, 1941, exactly 5 years after they'd captured Addis Ababa, Haile Selassie returned to his capital in triumph. Italy had lost Ethiopia faster than they'd conquered it. British and Ethiopian forces captured hundreds of thousands of Italian prisoners. The Italian East African Empire collapsed completely. Think about that. Italy had spent enormous resources conquering Ethiopia with tanks, planes, and poison gas. Then they lost it in 5 months to a force 1/3 their size. The humiliation was complete. Italy had now lost to Ethiopia twice. Once in 1896, when they should have had technological advantage, and again in 1941, when they had every advantage but competence. Conclusion. 11 Imwer, the 12/30. So what went wrong? How does a European power lose the same war twice, 40 years apart? First, racist overconfidence. Italy assumed African forces were inherently inferior. In 1896, they underestimated Ethiopian military capability. In 1935 and 41, they assumed technology alone would guarantee victory. Second, terrible leadership. Baratieri ignored his own officers' warnings in 1896. Mussolini's commanders in 1935 were often incompetent, and by 1941, Italian military leadership had collapsed. Third, logistics. Both invasions stretched Italian supply lines across brutal terrain. In both cases, Ethiopia's defenders used their knowledge of the land against invaders. Fourth, Ethiopian resilience. Menelik united his nation in 1896. Haile Selassie led resistance in exile. The Ethiopian people never stopped fighting. They defended their independence with incredible courage. The consequences were profound. Adwa in 1896 made Ethiopia a symbol of African resistance against colonialism. It inspired anti-colonial movements worldwide. It proved that European imperialism could be defeated. The 1935 invasion demonstrated the moral bankruptcy of fascism, poison gas used against civilians while the world watched and did nothing. And the 1941 liberation showed that Italy's military was fundamentally unprepared for modern warfare. Their failure in Ethiopia weakened them throughout World War II. Today, the Battle of Adwa is celebrated across Africa as proof that colonialism was never inevitable. Ethiopia remained independent throughout the colonial era, one of the very few African nations to do so. And Italy? They became the punchline of military history jokes. The army that lost to Ethiopia. Twice. That was Italy's double defeat in Ethiopia. 40 years apart. Same enemy. Same result. Different excuses. One of history's most repeated war blunders.